As I talk to you this afternoon, I want you to think about something that you're passionate about and that you're willing to share with other people that's unrelated to programming. Here's my example. I'm Brennan, and I'm really passionate about music. In fact, Alex kind of embarrassed me because that last track was my band. Over the past 10 years, I've learned that playing music is something that's really important to my well-being. I play in 2 bands, and all of my free time that's not dedicated to programming and community building, I dedicate to practicing and playing gigs. So I want to tell you a story about my first JSConf. It was 2011, it was Portland. I showed up, I was traveling alone. I had just started at Mozilla, and I didn't really know anyone, so I was just going by myself. And I was really shy, and I was anxious, because I was just super intimidated by all the awesome people that were there. There were people that I followed on Twitter. There were people whose videos I'd seen giving talks at previous JSConfs. And I was just super intimidating. It was intimidating for me, because I didn't know how I was going to fit in. I hadn't thought of myself as having done anything particularly noteworthy. So I just didn't know if I really belonged. So I was walking around the edge of the room, trying to be invisible, and Paul Irish spotted me and somehow recognized me from the internet. And he introduced himself and invited me into his conversation, and I just felt very welcome. And I asked Paul if I could share that just really small, tiny story, and he barely remembered it, because for him it wasn't a big deal at all. But for me, it was such an act of warmth and kindness at a time when I needed it. It made me feel welcome when I was anxious about having a place to fit in. Warmth and kindness matters. That's one of the reasons I wanted to share that story. Small actions matter. In the right context, even the smallest kindness can be deeply meaningful to someone in ways that are unpredictable. Paul didn't know I was going to be telling that story here. I asked him a week ago. It was just, for him, a throwaway action, but for me, something that really stuck with me. Also, congratulations on your wedding, Paul, wherever you are. The other reason I wanted to share that is because I want us to start thinking about how we welcome people into our communities. A lot of people approach communities in the same way that I walked into that conference, shy and worried about fitting in and anxious. Most new people go in and they try to stay invisible. They follow us on Twitter, they join our mailing list, they hang out in our IRC channels, but they don't interact with us. And we have a word for that. It's called lurking. And it's a great strategy. I've lurked on the edges of all of the communities that I've joined before deciding that that's a place where I could see myself fitting in. And I think we all have a job to convert these lurkers into contributors. Eventually, we hope that we can turn them into contributors, collaborators, and possibly even friends. And to do that, we need to remember to be patient and kind when the lurkers of our community, the people standing around the outside, try to make that first step. We were all novices once, and we need to remember what it was like when we were new and when we needed help. And that can be an incredibly hard thing to do. Because when you think about the same thing all the time on a regular basis, when you're so entrenched in your own community, it can be really easy to forget that people aren't also thinking about that same thing all the time. Something a colleague of mine, Selena Deckelman, once said is, the best thing we can do as experts in our field is make it safer for novices to experiment. And I think this is absolutely true, and more of us should spend time on that. If you want to get better at this, I recommend that you volunteer your time as a teacher or a mentor, and preferably do it in person. Because guiding someone through learning face-to-face helps you remember that you are dealing with a real person with their own unique background, rather than some abstract online identity that's in need of your time and energy. Other people are people too. And that's another thing we need to get better at. Recognizing that other people are people too, even online. We are all individual human beings with our own individual needs and values and feelings, and we need to respect that. Last year, there was a post on the Linux kernel developer mailing list where Linus tears into another developer, tells him to shut the fuck up in all caps, and then rips him apart for the way he handled some situation. And some of the developer response I saw to that really bummed me out. I saw people saying, you need to have thicker skin if you want to be a programmer, or shouldn't get in development if you want to be coddled. And that's some really defeatist language. It's saying we have a culture of abuse that tears people down, and it's your job to change and get used to that, rather than our responsibility to start treating people better. I commend Shara Sharp, who's a developer on the kernel, and she put herself out there saying that they really shouldn't stand for that abuse in their community. And Linus replied to Sarah, and his response left me even more despondent than the original post. And I want to read part of it to you. I do it partly because it's who I am, and partly because, honestly, I despise being subtle or nice. I simply don't believe in being polite or politically correct. Political correctness, I want to say a quick word about that before I move on. I see that term thrown a lot around in arguments on the internet, and every time I see it brought up, it's by the people who are resisting change. And it's used as a way to shut down conversations by appealing to people's fears. People hear politically correct, and they think that all the life of their culture will be extinguished if that's the path we go down. That's why people throw it into arguments. They want other people to back them up and say, oh no, we can't go down that slippery slope. I'm not going to start wearing a tie to work. So when you see this come up in an argument, I want you to remember it's a loaded term and that you should rarely take it at face value. That doesn't mean you have to reject everything the person is saying, but it means you should think about it. Just realize that political correctness is not, it's a loaded term. Anyway, being nice is not about being politically correct at all. Being nice is about respecting another human being as an individual with their own feelings, needs, and values. Last year, I saw Isaac Schluter give a talk called Building Compassionate Communities in Tech. It's excellent. You should absolutely watch it online. You can just go type Building Compassionate Communities into Ask Jeeves and you'll find it. It's the first result. And in his talk, he recommends this book called Nonviolent Communication. And after he recommended that, I read it. And I was actually really excited to see in Jen Turner's talk 2 days ago, Lessons in Emotional Safety, she also recommended that book. So this is the third time, so read it. But I want to read you a quote from that book that has stuck with me. We all pay dearly when people respond to our values and needs, not out of a desire to give from the heart, but out of fear, guilt, or shame. Sooner or later, we will experience the consequences of diminished goodwill on the part of those who comply with our values out of a sense of either external or internal coercion. They too pay emotionally, for they are likely to feel resentment and decreased self-esteem when they respond to us out of fear, guilt, or shame. Furthermore, each time others associate us in their minds with any of those feelings, the likelihood of their responding compassionately to our needs and values in the future decreases. Using guilt and public embarrassment and fear to motivate people may get things done in the short term, but it comes at a huge human cost. And this is not me saying you can't give criticism. We need criticism as software developers. That's how we build better software. Being nice means realizing that you are dealing with another human being and that how you give that criticism matters. We have a stereotype as programmers that we're unemotional and cold and that we operate on pure logic. And this stereotype is destroying us. We are human beings. We have emotions. And we feel it when we're on the receiving end of negativity. But so many of us have internalized an unrealistic standard of how we're supposed to be. So we avoid talking about it. We don't talk about how we feel. We don't talk about our emotions. We learn to ignore them, and we learn to bottle them up. And then we wonder why so many of us burn out. I want to tell a story that's going to seem unrelated, but I'm going to bring it back around, so just hang with me. I'm Hispanic, and most of my life I've struggled with my racial identity. My mother is from Panama. That's a small country in Central America. For those of you who are unaware, we have a canal. So my mother moved here when she was 18. A few years later, she had me. And my mom knew that the trouble that English as a second language students get into in early developmental education, especially where I was growing up and when I was growing up. I've actually heard stories of some personal friends who were English as a second language students, and they were held back because their teachers thought they were mentally retarded because they couldn't speak English. And so my mother made the decision to raise us in an English-only speaking household, so I never learned to speak Spanish. And that turned out to be a big deal for me because the other Hispanic kids all spoke Spanish, and I didn't fit in with them, and they held it against me because I couldn't speak Spanish. They made me, or I made myself feel like I didn't have the right to call myself a real Hispanic. Years later, I'm living with a guy who's a friend of a friend, and he would sometimes start complaining about Hispanic people, not to other people, like to me, to my face. I didn't mention this before, but he also collected guns, and I was quite intimidated. But after a couple of times, I get up the courage to say to him, dude, you know I'm Hispanic, right? And he goes, like, without missing a beat, he's like, oh, well, no, you're not really Hispanic, you're different. I was different. I didn't fit into his mental model, his stereotype of what a Hispanic person was, so I couldn't possibly be one. And the worst part is that at the time, I thought he was right. When he said that to me, it brought up all of my issues about how I thought about myself. And I thought, yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not a real Hispanic. Real programmer. How many times have you guys heard that term? Thank you. I run a user group in New York with my pal Judge Smith called Brooklyn JS. We use the JSConf Code of Conduct, and we talk about it every meeting. We created Brooklyn JS because we wanted a safe place for people to come and learn from each other, but more importantly, to meet each other and see each other as real human beings. A couple of meetups ago, a guy went up to one of our attendees, a woman who's also a good friend of mine, and said, "You can't be a real programmer, you're too hot." This guy didn't even realize that he went up to someone and said the equivalent of, "You don't look like how I think you should, so you don't belong." I was so mad and ashamed that this happened at my meetup. And I'm still trying to think of ways just beyond the code of conduct to make sure this doesn't happen again. But in the meantime, I want all of you to do something for me. Think really hard and try to make all of your unconscious stereotypes that you might have about programmers conscious. Think about them. What we look like, the types of things we're supposed to be interested in, how we're supposed to think and feel. I want you to think about those things, and I want you to remind yourself that all of those things are fucking bullshit. I want you to remember that we are all different, and the one guaranteed thing we have in common is that we write software, and that's it. Other than that, we're all individuals with our own identities, our own needs, and our own values. It's our responsibility as members of the community, and leaders of the community, and members of various communities, to build and maintain a culture where it's safe to express our different needs and values, where it's safe to just exist without emotional or physical fear. Think about the people lurking on the edges and what kind of example you want to set for them. Think about the effect your words have on other people. Adam Brault gave a powerful talk at JSConf last year called People First, and many of the things that he said in that talk have stuck with me, but I want to share one particular quote. "No matter your title, it is your job to make the people around you feel cared about, empowered, encouraged, and humanized." As much as the internet connects us, it's incredibly dehumanizing. We need to recognize and embrace our responsibility for taking care of each other. We need to recognize and acknowledge the positive influence we have on each other's lives. It shouldn't need to be a special occasion to let a friend know how much they mean to you. If you see someone who's under attack, stand up for them. And if you see someone who's hurting, reach out to them. And if you yourself are hurting, talk to someone. Don't ignore it. About 8 years ago, I lived through my worst period of depression. I was in college at the time, and I stopped going to class. I failed out of school. I stopped going to work. I dropped all of my hobbies. My computer broke, and I didn't even care. I didn't bother to get it fixed. I don't know what other people's depression looks like, but for me, it's a profound, deep emptiness. But I never talked about it with anyone. I didn't want to burden people, and frankly, I was ashamed with myself. How couldn't I control this? I don't have a lot of memories from that period, but I do remember the day I decided to get help. I was driving on a freeway, and a car was coming in the opposite direction. And as it was about to pass me, I had a thought that almost turned into an action. I could swerve into this car right now, and it wouldn't matter. And it was a thought so strong, I could feel it in my hands physically, that I really wanted to do it. And at the last moment, I didn't. I thought about what I'd almost done, and I thought about my mom, and I thought about my brother, and I pulled over and I started crying. And it took that moment and coming that close for me to realize that I couldn't handle it on my own, and this is something that I couldn't change in myself, or by myself. And I know that story makes a lot of you feel awkward, so I apologize. If it's any consolation, I'm pretty sure I feel more awkward about it, so... But if I was talking to you about breaking my wrist or getting malaria, that would have been an easy story to tell. But we have a social stigma around mental health, so it's not something we talk about. And so many of us suffer quietly and alone, ashamed that we have this problem in ourselves that we can't fix. And I think it might be worse for programmers, because not only do we have that additional stereotype of being unemotional, but because we are supposed to be able to fix things. It's kind of what we do. So we need to take care of each other. Let people know that you're there for them. So when I was telling some of my friends I was going to give this talk, the most common advice was, oh, just be funny. Just use a lot of animated GIFs, so I'm pretty sure I nailed it. But for real, I know this has been some sustained real talk, and I want to thank you for giving me your attention. I actually feel incredibly positive about our future, more than I have in the past. I see us starting to have open, hard conversations about a lot of this stuff where we wouldn't have dared talk about it before. I see more people starting to recognize that there is humanity behind what we do, and seeing that we need to learn how to deal with that just as much as we need to learn how to deal with anything else in our field. I've met and I continue to meet so many awesome people through programming and made friendships that even if I quit programming tomorrow, I'd want to maintain. In the beginning, I asked you to think about some of the things you're passionate about that aren't programming. And as we wrap this up and go into our last evening of celebration, I want you to remember those things. And when you talk to each other, don't just talk about what you do or where you work. Bring your entire self to the conversation. You are so much more than just your opinion on Ember or promises. Remember that being awesome to each other starts with being awesome to ourselves. Thank you very much. I love you all.